The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the trees as Mike Thompson pulled his old blue pickup truck into his favorite hunting spot. He'd been coming to these woods for the past 20 years, and something about the crisp October air made him feel like today would be different. The leaves had turned into beautiful shades of red and orange, creating a natural carpet on the forest floor. Mike wasn't like most hunters who came here just for the thrill. For him, these early morning hunts were his way of finding peace, away from his busy life running the local hardware store. At 45, with laugh lines around his eyes and salt and pepper hair, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew these woods like the back of his hand. As he stepped out of his truck, the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth filled his lungs. He checked his hunting gear one last time, his father's old rifle that he'd inherited, a thermos full of hot coffee, black, just like his dad used to drink it, and his lucky orange vest that had seen better days but still did its job. The woods were quiet that morning, almost too quiet. Usually, you'd hear squirrels rushing through the branches or birds calling to each other, but today was different. Mike had been tracking a particular deer for the past week. He'd seen its tracks near the old creek bed and had a feeling it would be back. Walking through the forest, his boots barely made a sound on the soft ground. He'd learned this skill from his Uncle Tom, who always said, "The forest tells you its secrets if you're quiet enough to listen." Mike smiled at the memory. Uncle Tom had been gone for 5 years now, but his wisdom lived on in these moments. After about an hour of careful tracking, Mike decided to climb up to his favorite spotting point, a small ridge that overlooked a clearing. He pulled out his binoculars. They were nothing fancy, just a reliable pair he'd bought from Johnson's Sporting Goods 10 years ago. As he scanned the area, something caught his eye that didn't belong. At first, it was just a flash of white against the dark bark of an old oak tree. Mike adjusted his binoculars, thinking maybe it was just a plastic bag that someone had carelessly left behind. But as he focused the lenses, his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't trash at all, it was moving. The morning mist was starting to clear, and through his binoculars, Mike could make out what looked like an animal tied to the tree. His first thought was that maybe another hunter had marked a spot, but something didn't feel right. The white shape was too big to be a hunting marker, and it was definitely moving. Mike checked his watch, 7:15 a.m. He had plenty of daylight left, and his curiosity was getting the better of him. Setting aside his original plans for the deer, he decided to investigate. As he made his way down from his spotting point, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods seemed to agree, with the wind picking up slightly, rustling through the leaves like whispered warnings. He moved carefully, staying alert for any signs of danger. 20 years of hunting had taught him that unexpected situations in the woods needed to be approached with caution. As he got closer, he could hear something, a soft whining sound that made his skin prickle. It reminded him of the time he'd found an injured fox caught in some old farming wire, but this sound was different, almost desperate. About 50 yards out, Mike stopped and took another look through his binoculars. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, tied to the massive oak tree, was a dog, and not just any dog, but what appeared to be a beautiful husky. Its white and gray coat stood out starkly against the dark forest backdrop, like a bright flag signaling for help. Mike's mind raced with questions. Who would do something like this? How long had the dog been out here? And most importantly, why? As he stood there, processing what he was seeing, he noticed something else. The way the dog kept looking anxiously at something beyond the tree, as if trying to tell him there was more to this story than met the eye. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the soft sound of the dog's whimpers. Mike gripped his rifle a little tighter, not out of fear, but from a growing sense of determination. Whatever was going on here, he knew his morning had just taken an unexpected turn. The deer could wait. Right now, there was something much more important that needed his attention. Looking back at his truck, now hidden behind the morning mist and trees, Mike made a decision. He'd seen plenty of strange things in these woods over the years, but this was different. This wasn't about hunting anymore. This was about doing what was right. With careful steps, he began making his way toward the oak tree, unaware that what he was about to discover would change not just his morning, but his entire life. Mike's heart was pounding as he got closer to the oak tree. Each step brought more details into focus, and with each detail, his concern grew deeper. The morning dew had soaked through the fallen leaves, making his footsteps nearly silent as he approached. He could see the dog more clearly now, a beautiful husky with striking blue eyes that seemed to hold a story of their own. The sight before him made his stomach turn. The rope around the dog's neck wasn't just any rope, it was the kind you'd buy at a hardware store for hanging up Christmas lights. Mike knew because he sold the same type at his store. It was frayed at the edges, suggesting the dog had been trying to break free. A plastic water bowl lay on its side nearby, bone dry, with leaves stuck to its surface. Someone had obviously planned to leave the dog here. "Hey there, buddy," Mike called out softly, keeping his voice low and gentle. The husky's ears perked up, but instead of showing fear, the dog watched him with an almost human-like intelligence. Mike had grown up around dogs. His family had always had at least two running around their farm, and he knew that huskies were smart, but there was something different about this one's behavior. As he got within 10 feet, he noticed more details that made his blood boil. There were empty food bags scattered around, the kind you get from gas stations, beef jerky packages and chip bags. Someone had left enough food to ease their conscience, but not enough to keep the dog alive for long. The ground around the tree was worn down to bare earth where the husky had paced in circles, probably trying to free itself. Mike set his rifle down carefully against a nearby tree and slowly pulled off his hunting gloves. The dog watched his every move but didn't bark or growl. Instead, it kept making these soft whining sounds and looking over toward a steep ravine about 50 feet away. At first, Mike thought maybe the dog was just scared of the drop-off, but something about its behavior seemed more urgent than fearful. "It's okay," Mike said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. He always carried a few dog treats with him while hunting, a habit he kept up even after losing his old hunting companion, Buck, to old age last year. The husky's nose twitched at the smell, but surprisingly, it didn't lunge for the treat. Instead, it looked again toward the ravine, then back at Mike, as if trying to tell him something. Moving closer, Mike could see that despite its ordeal, the dog was well cared for, or at least it had been before being abandoned. Its coat, though muddy and tangled now, was thick and healthy. There was a spot of lighter fur on its chest in the shape of a heart, and its paws were large, suggesting it was still young, maybe not even 2 years old. The rope was tied with several complex knots, the kind that wouldn't come loose easily. "Who did this to you?" Mike muttered, anger mixing with sadness in his voice. He'd seen some thoughtless things in his years of hunting, littered camping sites, abandoned gear, even the occasional poacher's trap, but this was different. This was cruel in a way that made no sense to him. As he worked to untie the knots, the husky became more agitated, not from fear, but from what seemed like frustration. Its whines grew more insistent, and it kept pulling toward the ravine. Mike had learned long ago to trust animals' instincts. They often knew things humans didn't. He remembered the time his childhood dog, Rusty, had acted strange one morning, leading the family to discover a broken gas line in their basement. The knots were tight, and his fingers were getting cold in the morning air. Mike talked softly to the dog as he worked, telling it about Buck, about the morning so far, about anything that came to mind. It seemed to calm the husky, though its eyes never stopped darting between him and the ravine. He noticed the dog's nose was dry, a sign of dehydration. Reaching for his canteen, Mike poured some water into his cut hand. The husky lapped it up eagerly but quickly returned to its anxious behavior. It was then that Mike noticed something else. There were 2 sets of paw prints in the muddy ground around the tree. The second set was slightly larger with a different pattern. His hunter's instinct for tracking kicked in, and he followed the prints with his eyes. They led straight toward the ravine. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This husky wasn't just abandoned, it was left here with another dog. The way it kept looking toward the ravine, its refusal to focus on food or water, the desperate whining, it all made sense now. Something had happened to the other dog, and this loyal husky had been forced to watch, unable to help because of the rope holding it back. Mike stood up, his joints creaking from crouching too long. The morning had grown warmer, but he felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't over yet. He needed to investigate that ravine, but first, he had to free this dog. As he returned to working on the knots, he made a silent promise to both himself and the husky. He wouldn't leave these woods until he knew the full story, no matter what that might mean for his hunting plans. After 20 years of hunting in these woods, Mike thought he'd seen everything. He'd tracked deer through snowstorms, helped lost hikers find their way back to the trail, and even once stumbled upon an old moonshine still hidden away in a hollow. But this situation with the husky had him completely stumped. The dog's behavior wasn't just unusual, it was telling him a story he needed to understand. Finally, the last knot came loose. Mike expected the husky to bolt straight for the ravine, but instead, it stayed close to him, pressing against his leg as if seeking reassurance. He ran his hand along its back, feeling the tense muscles beneath the thick fur. "What are you trying to tell me, buddy?" he whispered, watching as the dog's eyes remained fixed on the distant slope. The morning had warmed up a bit, but the shadows under the trees still held onto their chill. Mike pulled out his thermos and poured some water into the cap, setting it down for the husky. The dog took a few quick laps but remained restless, taking a few steps toward the ravine before coming back to Mike's side. It was like watching someone trying to speak without words. Looking around the area one more time, Mike noticed things his hunter's eyes had missed earlier. There were tire tracks partially hidden by fallen leaves about 30 yards back, not from his truck. These were wider, possibly from a larger vehicle. Someone had driven pretty close to this spot, which wasn't easy given the terrain. This wasn't a random act. Whoever left these dogs here had planned it. Mike secured his rifle across his back and gathered his gear. If he was going to investigate the ravine, he needed to be prepared for anything. The slope looked steep from here, and the recent rains had probably made the ground unstable. He'd seen enough accidents in these woods to know that even experienced hunters could get into trouble on terrain like this. The husky seemed to sense his decision to investigate. Its whole demeanor changed, becoming more alert, more purposeful. Mike couldn't help but think about Buck, his old hunting dog, and how they used to read each other's movements without any words. This husky had that same kind of intelligence in its eyes. "All right, let's do this together," Mike said, more to himself than the dog. He pulled out his phone and checked for signal, just one bar, but it would have to do. He quickly texted his location to his buddy Tom, something he always did when changing positions during a hunt. It was a safety habit his father had drilled into him years ago. As they approached the ravine, Mike could feel the ground changing under his boots. The fallen leaves were slick here, hiding loose soil underneath. The husky moved with more confidence than he did, clearly familiar with this path. Every few steps, it would look back at him as if making sure he was still following. The sound of running water grew louder as they got closer to the edge. There must have been a stream at the bottom of the ravine, swollen from the recent rains. Mike got down on his hands and knees when he reached the edge, not trusting the crumbling soil. The husky whined more urgently now, pacing back and forth along the rim of the slope. What Mike saw when he peered over the edge made his breath catch in his throat. About halfway down the steep incline, partially hidden by fallen branches and leaves, was a flash of brown fur. The shape was unmistakable, another dog, larger than the husky, lying motionless on a narrow ledge. Mike's mind raced with questions. Was the dog still alive? How long had it been there? The husky's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. It hadn't been abandoned alone. These dogs were probably family pets, dumped together by someone who didn't want them anymore. The thought made his jaw clench with anger. The brown dog was a chocolate lab, from what he could see. It must have tried to escape and slipped down the slope. The husky had been forced to watch, helplessly tied to the tree as its companion fell. No wonder the dog had been so desperate to communicate with him. Mike sat back on his heels, thinking through his options. The slope was too steep and unstable for him to climb down safely alone. One wrong step could send him tumbling down to the stream below. He needed help, proper equipment, and a solid plan. But first, he needed to know if the lad was still alive. "Hey," he called out, his voice echoing slightly against the ravine walls. The brown shape moved slightly, and a weak bark echoed back up. The husky's reaction was immediate. It barked loudly, tail wagging for the first time since Mike had found it. The lad was alive, but who knew how badly it was hurt? Pulling out his phone again, Mike was relieved to see he still had that single bar of service. This situation was bigger than him now. He needed help, and he knew exactly who to call. The local ranger station was only about 20 minutes away by car, and they had dealt with animal rescues before. Plus, his buddy Steve, who worked construction, had rescue equipment in his truck, the kind of ropes and harnesses that could make the difference in a situation like this. As he dialed the ranger station's number, Mike kept one hand on the husky's back, feeling its trembling slowly calm under his touch. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows down into the ravine. His hunting trip had turned into something completely different, but looking at the loyal husky beside him, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The minutes seemed to crawl by as Mike waited for help to arrive. He'd managed to reach both the ranger station and his friend Steve, but now came the hardest part, waiting. The husky hadn't left his side, but its eyes remained fixed on the spot where its friend lay trapped on the ledge. Every few minutes, Mike would call down to the lab, and a weak bark would echo back up, each response a small relief. From his position at the edge of the ravine, Mike could now see more details of the scene below. The chocolate lab had somehow ended up on a small natural ledge about 30 feet down. Any further, and it would have fallen all the way to the stream at the bottom. It was as if some higher power had placed that ledge exactly where it needed to be. The lad's brown coat was muddy and matted, but Mike could see it breathing. Its back leg was twisted at an awkward angle, probably injured in the fall. What really caught his attention, though, were the marks around its neck, identical to the rope burns he'd found on the husky. These dogs hadn't just been abandoned, they'd been deliberately tied up and left to face whatever fate had in store for them. Mike pulled off his hunting jacket and spread it on the ground, encouraging the husky to lie down. "You must be exhausted, buddy," he said softly, noticing how the dog's paws were raw from trying to break free from the rope. Still, it wouldn't fully relax, keeping its head up and eyes fixed on its friend below. The morning fog had lifted completely now, revealing just how treacherous the ravine really was. The recent rains had carved small channels in the soil, making the slope even more unstable. Loose rocks and branches littered the incline, and Mike could see where the lab had tried to climb back up, leaving long scratch marks in the dirt. He thought about his own dog Buck, who he'd lost last year. Buck would have done the same thing for another dog, never giving up, staying loyal until the end. These two dogs clearly had that same bond. The husky could have tried to run away after Mike freed it, but instead it stayed, determined to help its friend. The sound of vehicles approaching brought both Mike and the husky to attention. The husky's ears perked up, but it didn't bark or show any signs of fear. Instead, it looked at Mike as if asking whether these new arrivals were here to help. The trust in those blue eyes made Mike's throat tight with emotion. Ranger Wilson was the first to arrive, his green truck bouncing along the rough trail. Steve's pickup followed close behind, loaded with rescue gear. Mike had known both men for years. They were exactly the kind of people you wanted around in a situation like this. Ranger Wilson had helped rescue countless animals over his 20-year career, and Steve had done volunteer work with the local fire department's rescue team. "What a mess," Ranger Wilson said as he surveyed the scene, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. He knelt down to check on the husky, his movements gentle and practiced. The dog allowed the examination but kept looking between Mike and the ravine, its concern obvious to everyone. Steve was already unloading his gear, ropes, harnesses, and a sturdy rescue basket. "We'll need to set up an anchor point," he said, eyeing the sturdy oak trees nearby. "Mike, you said the lab's still responsive." As if on cue, another weak bark echoed up from the ravine. The husky immediately stood up, its tail wagging slightly. The three men exchanged glances. They needed to work fast. The lab had been out there all night, probably injured and definitely dehydrated. Ranger Wilson pulled out his radio and called for the local vet to be on standby. Meanwhile, Steve and Mike began setting up the rescue equipment. The husky watched every movement intently, occasionally pacing between them and the ravine's edge, as if supervising their preparation. "Looks like these dogs were dumped here deliberately," Ranger Wilson said, examining the rope marks on the husky's neck. "We've had reports of missing pets in the county lately. This might be connected." His voice was calm, but Mike could hear the underlying anger. Wilson had seen his share of animal cruelty cases, but something like this, it never got easier. As they worked to secure the rescue lines, Mike kept thinking about the sequence of events that had brought him here. If he hadn't decided to check his usual hunting spot that morning, if he hadn't noticed that flash of white fur through his binoculars, if the husky hadn't been so persistent in communicating its friend's location, any small change could have led to a very different outcome. The rescue setup was almost complete. Steve, who would be making the descent, double-checked every knot and connection. The husky had moved closer to the edge again, watching the preparations with an almost human-like understanding. Its friend had survived the night, alone and injured, but help had finally arrived. Mike crouched down beside the husky, gently scratching behind its ears. "Your friend's going to be okay," he said softly. "You did good, buddy. You did real good." The dog leaned against his leg, and for the first time that morning, some of the tension seemed to leave its body. It was as if it finally believed that its long vigil was coming to an end. The rescue operation began as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Steve, now fully equipped with climbing gear, looked like a professional rescuer rather than the construction worker Mike knew him to be. The ropes were secured to 2 solid oak trees, creating a stable anchor system that would allow Steve to safely reach the injured lab. "I've got eyes on the dog," Steve called out as he began his careful descent. "Looks like it's alert but definitely injured." He moved with careful precision, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The ravine's walls were even more treacherous up close, with loose soil crumbling away under the slightest pressure. Mike and Ranger Wilson managed the safety lines from above, while the husky watched every movement with intense focus. Its behavior had changed since the rescue team arrived. There was still concern in those blue eyes, but also what looked like hope. Every few minutes, it would look up at Mike as if seeking reassurance that everything was going according to plan. "Easy does it," Ranger Wilson called down as Steve navigated a particularly tricky section. Years of handling animal rescues had taught Wilson the importance of staying calm, but Mike could hear the tension in his voice. One wrong move on this unstable slope could turn a rescue mission into something much more serious. The lab, hearing Steve's approach, lifted its head and wagged its tail weakly. Despite its injured state, the dog's friendly nature showed through. Steve paused about 10 feet above the ledge, assessing the situation. "The ledge looks stable enough," he reported back. "But that back leg is definitely broken. We'll need to be extra careful moving it." Mike found himself holding his breath as Steve made the final approach to the ledge. The husky pressed against his leg, trembling slightly. He reached down to scratch behind its ears, something he'd noticed helped calm the dog. "Your friend's going to be okay," he whispered, hoping he was right. Steve reached the ledge and immediately began talking softly to the lab, letting it get used to his presence. The brown dog's tail kept wagging, but it whimpered when Steve gently touched its injured leg. "Yeah, definitely broken," Steve confirmed. "But this guy's tough. Made it through the night without giving up." The rescue basket was lowered next, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Steve caught it and carefully positioned it on the narrow ledge. Getting an injured dog into a rescue basket was never easy, but they had to try. The lad, despite its pain, seemed to understand they were trying to help. It remained surprisingly calm as Steve began the delicate process of moving it. "Good boy," Steve kept saying, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're doing great, buddy." The lab let out a few pained whimpers, but didn't struggle or snap. It was as if it knew this discomfort was necessary for its rescue. From above, the husky whined in response to its friend's distress, but stayed put beside Mike. The most challenging part came when Steve had to lift the lab into the rescue basket. The ledge was narrow, making it difficult to maneuver. One wrong move could send them both tumbling down the remaining distance to the stream below. Mike and Ranger Wilson tightened their grip on the safety lines, ready for anything. "Almost there," Steve called up, his voice strained with effort. The lab, despite its size, didn't resist. Somehow, it seemed to understand the importance of staying still. With one final careful movement, Steve managed to secure the dog in the basket. The husky's tail began wagging furiously. It was as if it knew its friend was finally safe. The next part of the rescue required perfect coordination. Ranger Wilson took charge, his experience showing in every comm command. "Nice and steady," he called out as they began raising the basket. "Keep it level." Steve guided the basket from below, making sure it didn't catch on any protruding rocks or branches. Mike could feel the weight of the lab through the rope in his hands. The basket moved slowly upward, swaying slightly but staying stable. The husky watched intently, its eyes never leaving the basket. Every few feet, they'd pause to make sure everything was secure before continuing. As the basket neared the top, the lab lifted its head and barked, a stronger sound than before. The husky immediately responded with an excited bark of its own, as if they were having a conversation only they could understand. Despite everything these dogs had been through, their bond was unbroken. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the basket reached the top. Mike and Ranger Wilson carefully pulled it onto solid ground, while Steve made his way back up. The moment the basket was secure, the husky was there, nose pressed against the mesh, whining softly to its friend. The lab's tail was still wagging, and it tried to lick the husky's nose through the basket. Despite its injured leg and the ordeal it had been through, the dog's first concern seemed to be reassuring its friend. Mike felt a lump in his throat watching their reunion. It was a reminder of the incredible bonds animals could form with each other. "We need to get them both to the vet," Ranger Wilson said, already on his radio to update the clinic. "The lab needs immediate attention for that leg, and both dogs need to be checked for dehydration and other injuries." He paused, watching the two dogs together. "I've never seen anything quite like this." That husky never gave up on its friend. As they prepared to transport the dogs, Mike couldn't help but think about how different this morning had turned out from what he'd planned. He'd come out here looking for deer, but had found something far more meaningful instead. Looking at the two dogs, the loyal husky and its injured friend, he knew this was exactly where he was supposed to be. At the veterinary clinic, Mike couldn't bring himself to leave. He sat in the waiting room, still in his hunting clothes, watching as people came and went. The husky had been reluctant to leave its friend's side, but the vet staff had managed to separate them so they could treat both dogs properly. Every time the door to the treatment area opened, the husky's ears would perk up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the lab. Ranger Wilson had been making calls all morning, piecing together a story that was bigger than anyone had expected. He walked back into the waiting room, his face showing a mix of satisfaction and anger. "Remember those missing pet reports from the past couple weeks?" he said, sitting down next to Mike. "Turns out these two are part of that story." The ranger pulled out his tablet, showing Mike a series of posts from the local community Facebook page. There were dozens of them, people reporting their pets missing, all within the last month. Most of the disappearances had happened in the early morning hours or late at night, when the streets were quiet and few people were around. "The lab belongs to the Robinsons," Wilson explained, pulling up a particular post. "They live about 20 minutes from town. Their dog went missing from their fenced backyard 2 weeks ago. They thought someone had left the gate open by accident, but now we know better." The post showed a picture of the chocolate lab, healthy and happy, playing with a little boy in a backyard. Mike felt his fists clench. The thought of someone stealing a family's pet made his blood boil. "What about the husky?" he asked, looking over at the white dog, who was currently being checked by one of the vet techs. The husky's eyes met his, and its tail wagged slightly. "That's where it gets interesting," Wilson said, scrolling through more reports. The husky was reported stolen on the same night as the lab, but from a different family. They live on the other side of town. The dogs didn't know each other before this happened. He shook his head in amazement. "Makes their bond even more remarkable." Just then, the clinic's door opened and a family rushed in, a couple with 2 young children. The woman's eyes were red from crying, and the little boy was clutching a worn dog collar. "These must be the Robinsons." Ranger Wilson stood to greet them, but before he could say anything, the little boy spotted the husky and gasped. "Look, that's the dog from the gas station video," he exclaimed, pointing at the husky. His parents and Ranger Wilson all turned to look at him. The boy continued, excited to share what he knew. "Remember Dad? In the video from Mr. Pete's store, there was a white dog in the back of that truck." Wilson's eyes lit up. "What video?" he asked, crouching down to the boy's level. The father pulled out his phone, explaining how they'd been checking security footage from local businesses ever since their lad went missing. One of the gas station owners, Pete, had given them access to his overnight cameras. The video, though grainy, showed everything. A large pickup truck with out-of-state plates had pulled into the gas station around 2 a.m. In the truck's bed, Barely visible in the poor lighting were several dogs. The husky's white fur stood out clearly, and next to it was a darker shape that could have been the lab. "We've seen this truck before," Wilson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He explained to Mike and the family how similar reports had come in from neighboring counties. Someone had been stealing pets, possibly to sell them in other states. But these two dogs had apparently caused them trouble. Maybe they were too big or too difficult to handle. The vet came out then, bringing good news about the lab. The break was clean and surgery had gone well. The dog was dehydrated and bruised, but would make a full recovery. The husky was also doing fine. Aside from some rope burns and dehydration, it was in good health. As they talked, Mike watched the little boy walk over to the husky. The dog, usually cautious with strangers, seemed to sense something special about the child. It gently licked his hand, making him giggle. The boy's mother wiped tears from her eyes, watching the scene. "You know," she said softly, "we've been looking for our dog for 2 weeks straight, putting up posters, checking shelters, posting online. Never stopped hoping we'd find him." She looked at Mike with grateful eyes. "If you hadn't gone hunting today." Mike thought about all the little decisions that had led to this moment. Choosing to hunt in that particular spot, noticing the flash of white fur, following the husky's signals. "Sometimes things happen for a reason," he said, watching as the husky continued to comfort the little boy. Ranger Wilson was already coordinating with police departments in neighboring counties, sharing the gas station footage and license plate information. The theft ring would be caught. It was only a matter of time now. But Mike's thoughts were on something else. He couldn't stop thinking about the husky, how it had stayed loyal to a dog it had only known for 2 weeks, how it had never given up trying to get help. The vet had said both dogs would need to stay at the clinic overnight for observation. As the Robinson family prepared to leave, promising to return first thing in the morning, the little boy turned to the husky. "Thank you for taking care of my dog," he said solemnly, giving the husky a gentle pat. The husky's tail wagged, and for the first time since Mike had found it, the dog looked truly at peace. A week had passed since that eventful morning in the woods. Mike sat on his front porch, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise. His hunting gear lay untouched in the corner. He hadn't felt like going back out since the rescue. His mind kept returning to those two dogs and their remarkable story of friendship and loyalty. The local newspaper had run a story about the rescue, complete with pictures of both dogs at the vet clinic. The article had sparked a wave of tips about the pet theft ring, leading to several arrests across 3 states. Turned out the thieves had been stealing pets for months, selling them for quick cash in other states. The gas station footage had been the break law enforcement needed. Mike's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the Robinsons, sending him another update about their lad's recovery. The dog was doing great. The cast would come off in a few weeks, and it was already trying to play fetch from its bed. They'd been sending him regular updates, grateful for his role in bringing their family back together. But it was the husky that kept appearing in Mike's thoughts. After the excitement died down, they'd learned more about its story. The dog had belonged to an elderly couple who had recently moved into a nursing home. Their son had been planning to take the husky, but it was stolen before he could pick it up. Now, with his job requiring frequent travel, he realized he couldn't give the dog the home it deserved. The sun was fully up now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Mike heard a car pulling into his driveway, Ranger Wilson's familiar green truck. The ranger had called last night, saying he needed to discuss something important. Mike had a feeling he knew what this was about. "Morning," Wilson called out, climbing out of his truck. He looked different in casual clothes, more relaxed. "Got some news you might be interested in." He joined Mike on the porch, accepting the offered cup of coffee. "Remember how you mentioned losing your hunting dog last year?" Mike nodded, thinking of Buck. The old dog had been his constant companion for 12 years before age finally caught up with him. The woods hadn't felt the same since. "Been pretty quiet around here without him," Mike admitted, looking at the empty space where Buck used to lie on the porch. Wilson took a sip of coffee before continuing. "Well, I just got off the phone with the husky's former family. They've been worried sick about finding the right home for him. When I mentioned you..." He let the sentence hang in the air, watching Mike's reaction. The idea had been growing in Mike's mind ever since that day in the woods. The way the husky had trusted him, how it had communicated its friend's need for help, its calm presence during the rescue. It all reminded him of Buck. But this wasn't just about replacing his old dog. This husky had shown a spirit that touched something deep in Mike's heart. "You think he'd adjust okay?" Mike asked, already knowing he wanted to say yes. "After everything he's been through." Wilson smiled. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" He gestured toward his truck. In the back seat, a familiar white face was watching them, blue eyes bright with recognition. The husky's tail started wagging the moment it saw Mike. With Wilson's help, Mike had already set up everything needed for a dog: food, bed, toys, even a new collar. He'd been hoping for this outcome, but hadn't dared to expect it. As they opened the truck door, the husky bounded out, heading straight for Mike. It remembered him, there was no doubt about that. "The Robinson kids want to call him Hero," Wilson said, watching as the dog circled excitedly around Mike. "Seems fitting, considering what he did for their dog. But you can change it if you want. He's your dog now, after all." Mike crouched down, letting the husky sniff his hand. "Hero," he said softly, testing the name. The dog's ears perked up and its tail wagged harder. "Yeah, I think that name works just fine." The husky, Hero now, followed Mike onto the porch, settling down in the exact spot where Buck used to lie. It was as if he knew this was home now. Mike felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Sometimes the best things in life came from unexpected places. Later that day, Mike took Hero for a walk in the woods, but not to hunt. Instead, they visited the oak tree where their story had begun. The rope marks around Hero's neck had healed, leaving no trace of that terrible night. As they stood there, a deer crossed their path, the same one Mike had been tracking that fateful morning. But instead of reaching for his rifle, he just watched it go, Hero sitting calmly beside him. "You know," Mike said to the dog, "I came out here that morning looking for something completely different." Hero looked up at him with those intelligent blue eyes. "But I think I found exactly what I needed instead." The Robinson family had invited them over for a visit that weekend. They wanted Hero to see his friend again, the lad he'd refused to abandon. Mike had already said yes. After all, some friendships deserve to be honored, even if they started in the strangest of ways. As they walked home through the autumn woods, Mike realized his life had changed in ways he never expected. He'd always thought of himself as the one doing the rescuing that day, but maybe it was the other way around. Hero had shown him something about loyalty, courage, and the unexpected ways love could enter your life. The husky trotted ahead on the trail, occasionally looking back to make sure Mike was following, just like he had done that morning in the woods. But this time, they were heading home together, two souls who had found each other in the most unexpected way, starting a new chapter in both their lives. Later that day, Mike took Hero for a walk in the woods, but not to hunt. Instead, they visited the oak tree where their story had begun. The rope marks around Hero's neck had healed, leaving no trace of that terrible night. As they stood there, a deer crossed their path, the same one Mike had been tracking that fateful morning. But instead of reaching for his rifle, he just watched it go, Hero sitting calmly beside him. "You know," Mike said to the dog, "I came out here that morning looking for something completely different." Hero looked up at him with those intelligent blue eyes. "But I think I found exactly what I needed instead." The Robinson family had invited them over for a visit that weekend. They wanted Hero to see his friend again, the lad he'd refused to abandon. Mike had already said yes. After all, some friendships deserve to be honored, even if they started in the strangest of ways. As they walked home through the autumn woods, Mike realized his life had changed in ways he never expected. He'd always thought of himself as the one doing the rescuing that day, but maybe it was the other way around. Hero had shown him something about loyalty, courage, and the unexpected ways love could enter your life. The husky trotted ahead on the trail, occasionally looking back to make sure Mike was following, just like he had done that morning in the woods. But this time, they were heading home together, two souls who had found each other in the most unexpected way, starting a new chapter in both their lives.